So even though during season one, you let me know towards the end of the season that not everything has to tie back to Senate Bill 4D and 154 and the post Surfside legislation. We'd be remiss not to preview season two without touching on where we are in that process. There has been a flurry of media talk about the impact of the condo legislation. You were recently featured on WSVN talking about that as well. And I think it would be great just to take the temperature and start to tie some of the concepts that we've been talking about: public transportation, live work, and housing in general, to where we are coming up into quarter four of 2024 and the actualization, the activation of those bills. Because all of it, believe it or not, as much as it feels like we've talked about Surfside legislation, it actually hasn't taken effect yet. And here we are now on the eve of it taking effect, ostensibly. David, where are we? And what is your preview, not only for our season, but the season for condo owners here in Florida, that this law is about to take effect?
Well, I read some comments by Representative Lopez that they won't be calling a special session, in particular because even though the studies have to be done, the money really is a year off. But I hate to disagree with her because she's so good at championing the cause of safety for condos and bringing people into fiscal responsibility. But because people see what the future is going to be, it's already affecting pricing, ability to sell your condo, price of the condo. And I'm not talking about the 5-star luxury hotel condos or the luxury high-end superstructures with 3,500 to 5,000 square feet at $5,000 a square foot or $3,000 a square foot. I'm talking about the older condos who are having difficulty selling and having difficulty getting a termination because it requires it is such that 5% of the owners can block the sale of a condo. And as I said in season one, I wrote a op-ed piece for the Miami Herald on this. I think they need to raise the objector percentage from 5% to 15%. Because quite frankly, 5 people out of 100 or 6 people out of 100 should not be able to stop the termination of a condo where 90% of the people want to sell to a developer. I don't think that's right. I think if democracy is going to work and it's going to be less than 100%, it should be 15%, certainly something higher than 5%, to stop the termination of a condo. And I would say this about terminations. In some cases, they're highly appropriate because spending $40 million to fix up an old condo is not economically feasible, even though you may want your view of the ocean or of the bay. I just don't think it's economically viable. And I do think that in some of these cases, the condo is suffering because you have the two factions, the faction that wants to fix it up and the faction that wants to not waste any more money, but instead terminate, get a good price, and walk away. Now, interestingly, when they walk away, where do they go?
Right.
And the answer is not South Florida.
I was going to say they're not moving anywhere in the neighborhood.
No, they're moving up to Jupiter or the Space Coast or somewhere like that.
And are there jobs to support that population? And so that's where we get into this conundrum. And again, not to be overly negative, but to preview the challenges, it feels to me like part of our gear shifting in season 2 is now practical application of the law and the impacts, as well as the new focus on safety, which leads to headlines like this. I'm going to read this to you from NBC6 in South Florida. The 40-year certification of Commodore Plaza, this is in Aventura, has been overdue for 13 years. The city of Aventura has been issuing violations, and now the 654 property owners for an upcoming Miami-Dade County unsafe structures hearing could mean they have to leave their units. that is one of what we know are going to be dozens of stories as these recertifications occur under the new law, where certifications are happening at 30 years or 25 years instead of 40. And there again, you've got this issue facing the county, right? That's a county issue, and certainly something we're going to talk to the mayor about, is saying there are associations out there who, as you pointed out just a few minutes ago, have not kept up. And we've talked about that mostly in the context of finance, and then this juxtaposition of let's terminate the condo, let's reinvest. This is not that choice. This is potentially forced homelessness for those who own in units like this. Putting your non-host hat on for a second. Now you're going to play condo attorney. What does an association like that do? I mean, so let's assume they appear before the safety board of the county and they say, no. Well, what happens?
Let me say this to you. The County Unsafe Structures Board has to be not swayed by the emotion of the 654 residents.
654 owners, which probably means 1,400 residents.
But it cannot be swayed if the structural integrity of the building is at stake. We cannot afford another Surfside disaster.
Agreed.
We cannot afford to have buildings that have pushed the 40-year certification to 53 years, if you will. That cannot be condoned. It cannot be sanctioned. It cannot be accepted. You must do these inspections timely. You must do the repairs timely. And if we're not going to make examples of buildings that don't follow the rules, what's the purpose of passing the laws? I'm going to be a strict constructionist. If you have a valid reason you couldn't find a contractor, the type of windows or doors are not able to be manufactured for 6 months, that's one thing. But 13 years later, you still haven't done the work. You still haven't passed the special assessment. You've kicked the can down the road beyond the original 30 years. Now you're this
is 13 years later. It's 53-year-old condo.
Right. And that has to be addressed. And at the Unsafe Structures Board, you cannot sit there and say, oh, but it's going to affect 654 families. If the safety is at issue in this building, then you've got to get out.
So let's say that everybody, for all intents and purposes, agrees with that, because safety is paramount and it comes first for those families, for neighbors, for everybody. Okay, so let's check that box and say, agreed, Unsafe Structures Board's going to have to do what they have to do. Constructionist or not, this is about life safety now. So if we had Vicky Lopez here and we had Jason Pizzo over there, and we know the way they're both tied to the bills that were passed, I would then be asking, and we're going to ask, so now what? Is this now time where we have to start lobbying for federal funds to say, because what we also can't afford to do is have the market gutted by forced terminations or forced evacuations of these structures. To your point, there's nowhere for them to go. Somebody the other day in a conversation compared the issue of condo reserves and timely infrastructure updates with a balloon mortgage, and basically said for a condo like this, they have been paying an artificially low maintenance rate for decades.
That's the truth.
And
it's
not
a fiction.
And
That's
now
truth.
The balloon payment has come and they can't afford it. So what ends up happening is they're going to lose the property, and that's
what foreclosures on balloon mortgages are all about.
Is this going to be a bailout situation? Is the state or even potentially the federal government going to have to bail out the South Florida housing market? Because if you took that 654 and you said, an average of 1.5 occupancy units, or 1,000 residents anyways, and we say, you and I have a good view of this market. There's 28,000 condo and homeowners associations in this state. Let's say this impacts to this degree, somewhere between 2 and 5% of those.
There's 2 million plus, not 28,000.
The 20,000 associations, and 2 million plus units, 28,000 associations.
Right.
But what I'm saying is, so let's imagine there are another, if there's 2 to 5% more of, these type of associations, we're talking about several hundred associations in the state meeting this. So you could be talking about hundreds of thousands of South Florida residents impacted in exactly the way that Commodore Plaza is right now. Does that rise to the level of state crisis? Is that now moving from intelligent safety mandate to housing crisis?
great question. I do think that both in transit and in terms of balloon mortgages for condos, if you will, for these reserves and life safety issues, I don't want to call it a federal bailout. I think the federal government has to put significant resources to South Florida for mass transit. Not a doubt about it. I don't know that our federal legislators have done enough from South Florida. We get roads, but we're not getting mass transit dollars, and we need those. And part of the problem is we haven't been able to prove viability and sustainability of the mass transit, which hopefully the Live Local Act will help us get.
All right, so you sound right now like a president on stage, somebody vying for the president on stage. You've redirected the question back to mass transit. Let's go back to housing.
But I want to say that the federal government's going to have to help in housing as well. And the way they're going to have to help is they're going to have to create programs to allow the condos to pay over a longer period of time. They're going to have a federal program or a state program in order to ensure for the banks that these condominiums can pay over 30 years instead of 5 or 10 or 15 years to make it affordable. And I agree with you. People have been living in artificially low overhead environments in condos for decades. Are we going to have fewer condos, but more high-end condos?
Right.
That, I think, is the bigger question. Are we going to have more multifamily apartment buildings and fewer condos, and the condos are going to be for the rich people only because they're the ones who can afford whatever the assessment is? They don't care.
Right. Well, they might care, but they can still write the check. I mean, nobody wants to spend the money if they don't have to. But I would also wager a bet to say more high-end condos are more up to speed on their basic infrastructure maintenance. Not universally, but I would say in general.
Well, they're also younger condos, right? Because it used to be 40, 50 years ago, you built these huge concrete structures. Now they build glass towers that are 50, 60, 70, now 100 stories they're going to build.
Right.
So it's a different ball game with those towers.
Right. One of the things we haven't tapped on in this topic is how did this happen? How did we get to where we are? Now, we know the cause and effect relationship between deferring long-term capital maintenance, and we understand that academically. How did, I mean, listen, I mean, I
can answer that.
I was going to say, like, back to the genesis of 718. I mean, Gary Polikoff, writing statute, and I mean, all the old stuff that went into that. I mean, back when, the original Continental Group was sort of the one and only manager. I mean, it was like, there is an antiquity here, and I'm curious from your perspective, because you've spent most of your life in South Florida, the genesis of this issue.
I think the genesis of this issue is allowing financial engineering, construction decisions to be made by non-professional lay people whose goal is to get reelected by the owners to a position on the board, which, by the way, people don't want to be on the board anymore. I was
going to say,
because
chilling effect of the laws, absolutely.
But for years and years, for decades, one of the issue was being proud of the fact that your assessments stayed the same and there was no increase. The one thing the owners come to the annual meeting to find out is, are we increasing the maintenance?
So how did all of these smart people, because, as you and our
they're
audience,
not that smart,
as you and our audience know, let me contextualize that statement. As you and our audience know, I've spent 20 years in property management and mostly in the high-end space. And, you're dealing with a lot of people who in their own right are extremely successful professionals. How do you think we wound up in a position where all those experienced business people look at the economics of their condominium in ways that they don't look at their own business? Like somehow condominiums are absolved of external macroeconomic forces. When the world continues to get more expensive, labor, insurance, the cost of goods and services, but then to your point, it becomes this point of pride, if not focus, to keep condo rates the same. don't people grasp onto the idea that you are somehow trying to again absolve the condo of the basic laws of economics?
Well, remember something. If you live in a condo and you're 78 years old and they tell you you need to reserve for the next 30 years, you don't care about 30 years from now. You don't care about 20 years from now. You probably don't care about 15 or 10 years from now. So what happens
and I've heard this argument a lot, of course.
So what happens is,
why am I paying for the next buyer? Why am I paying for the next generation?
And the reality is, while long-term viability is down and sooner or later the condo becomes more expensive to live in and therefore prices will come down, the reality is everybody's playing hot potato. No one wants to hold the potato, so you pass it on to the next guy.
But let me,
or musical chairs. But remember one other thing. They have to live with their neighbors. And the last thing you want is neighbors mad at you because you increased fees and maintenance, and they don't want special assessments. The reality is that the law which allowed people to waive reserves was a bad law.
Okay, so let's all right. So that's a hot quote. That's going to make the reel. So let me challenge you with this, and I'm going to use you as an example. You are X years old, and we're not going to say exactly how old, but we'll let the audience do its guesswork. Matter of public record. So you have a house on Miami Beach, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Do you expect to be alive in 50 years?
No.
Okay.
I wish I could come back. I always tell Lisa, that my wife, that I'm going to be cryogenically frozen,
and God help us all. Yeah.
So that I can come back in 250 or 300 years and spend my own money.
So you have a house on Miami Beach. You don't expect to live for 50 years.
That quote should go into the reel.
I'm pretty sure it won't. And your roof fails. So forget whatever reality is, but your roof fails, and you have to put a new roof on your house. And it's going to be a 50-year roof. You would do it.
I don't have a choice.
Why?
Because it's covering my house and preventing water from getting in.
Okay. So so here's how I'm going to challenge you then. I'm going to use that. I'm going to pivot off that and use it as an example. I think a lot of condo owners or single family homeowners at one point or another, especially those of a certain age, you're using a demographic that is particularly opposed in general to long-term reserving. They would rather, essentially self-insure, because you're right. They don't necessarily want to spend money on behalf of the next generation or a future unit owner, even their heirs, if you will. But they're treating that real estate as if it is subject to different fundamental conditions than single-family home real estate. And the reality is it's not. It's the same, which is to say, the value of the property, and now for the first time, we're now faced with this using a legal framework. The value of the property is predicated on its maintenance. Your ability to divest that value, whether on your behalf or your heirs' behalf, is tied to that maintenance. And to say all of a sudden the circumstances have changed, they have to maintain their infrastructure. They have to maintain the safety of these buildings, or the condo has no value.
Well, remember something. Most people who have a roof problem look to fix the least amount possible. They don't say, okay, I'm going to put on a roof. They say, can you patch it?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's what condo owners do.
Mm-hmm.
They say, can we just patch it quickly and, I'm not going to say cover it up, but can we make it look better? Can we make it...
Can we stop the leak?
Can we stop the leak? Can we, fix it in such a way that we don't have to spend all that money?
Right.
Can we do the pool deck by, just moving some of the pavers and doing a little bit of waterproofing rather than ripping up the whole deck, taking 2 years and putting down a waterproofing with a 20-year warranty? I remember many a condo saying to me, I don't want the 20-year warranty on the waterproofing.
I don't want the 20-year hot applied Sika. Just give me the cold applied 10-year warranty, or patch
or a 5-year
it. Or no warranty at all. Just stop
right.
it from leaking.
Right. And so what happens is, 5 years later, you're back in the same spot. And the reality is many homeowners do the same thing. Well, just just fix these 10 tiles, or, you know, if we can do it cheaper, please, let's do it cheaper rather than using a product that's going to last 30, 40, 50 years.
Not anymore. Those days are done. And so,
for condos, they're done. On
right.
a single family house, you can still say, just patch it.
Sure.
And stop the leak.
If your insurance company signs off.
That's true.
I mean, insurance is, and now.
Don't even get me started on insurance.
So we obviously had a great talk with Joe Knapp from Brown & Brown Insurance, who gave us some really great perspective on the condo insurance market. We're going to have another insurance conversation this season, but it's actually going to focus more on the practical coverages as opposed to, you know, the challenges and the pricing and all of that, but to basically say claims, inspections, because all of this now is coming to pass before. I mean, let's be honest. We've gone through decades of, you know, rote sign-offs by insurance companies, by
Not
engineers,
anymore.
and all of that's gone. So we're gonna do an engineering show. We're gonna have an engineer on who's gonna talk about, again, to say why.
Let's hope I don't fall asleep during the end.
Why patch jobs don't work. Well, no, I mean, listen, I think it's going to actually be one of the more telling shows, because all of a sudden condo owners and condo boards in particular, who used to just say, yeah, you got to get the engineer sign off, blah, blah, blah. Now it's like what the engineer is now saying can be the difference of, for all intents and purposes,
move out or don't move
the
out.
life and death of the condo. Think about what Commodore Plaza and Aventura is going through right now. Do you think those engineers are focused or on the hook? Think about what happened in Surfside.
You think they're going to sign off on letting people stay in a building and take on that personal risk? Remember, engineers who are licensed by the state of Florida have a responsibility to the public. Therefore, under the newer laws and after what happened in Surfside, I think what you're going to find is public officials who are going to be less swayed by individuals who say, I don't want to have to leave my home, whether it's building official or commissioners who would otherwise step in and say, you better let these people stay in their home. They're not going to say that anymore. They don't want the risk personally. You're going to have board members who don't want the risk because the laws have changed on them. And you're going to have engineers who are also saying, I don't want that liability. So you're going to see a lot less, I would call liberality, if you will. I don't know if that's a word, but a lot less liberal leeway, a lot less leeway in terms of bending over backwards to allow people to stay in their homes if you have condos that are, in essence, unsafe.
So I'm going to use that as a pivot point now into a couple remaining topics for our season preview. One is we're going to have on a couple of multifamily developers, because the multifamily space in South Florida is suddenly a more viable and interesting option.
It's booming.
And it's not to say that everybody who's building multifamily is making the kind of money they want to make. Obviously, you know, when you're talking about institutional grade assets like that, you've got, you know, investment grade assets like that. You've got all kinds of other conditions on the underwriting side, and interest rates have a huge impact, and as well as market absorption. But at a high level, the rental market in Miami and South Florida is changing. It mostly existed in what I would like to call a shadow market over the years, which is a lot of the condos would be rented independently by their unit owners, and that created the bulk of our quote-unquote multifamily space, especially here in the city of Miami and Miami Beach. Now you have a lot more traditional apartment buildings being developed who are owned by a single ownership and rented out more traditionally. And if I was moving to South Florida and did not know that I was going to be in South Florida permanently, renting a traditional multifamily, certainly right now seems a lot more appealing than renting a condo, where rent could jump by half year over year based on what that condo board was deciding. And so all that investment opportunity in condos also looks a lot different.
Well, I want to say this about multifamily. You have a lot of townhouse communities in West Broward and Palm Beach County, low-rise buildings. What's interesting there is the price of insurance has gone so high for all commercial property. I have a lot of friends who are developers who are clients of mine that says insurance is one of the biggest issues that makes building economically not viable right now.
Well, just getting construction insurance, I can tell you, as somebody who works with a lot of developers, just getting your construction insured can be right now the bottleneck. I mean, there are, you know, what used to be a couple of points on construction is now 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 points, and it makes construction inviable in a lot of cases, depending on the development.
And I also think that what you're ending up with is more multifamily that will come into play, but it's going to cost a lot more money for the end user renter than these older buildings that are out west that are low rise. If you're going to have high rise multifamily, you're going to have a greater expense, much like a condo. And
however, more stable than a condo because the expense is more predictable. Remember, in condo, the issue that we face is even if you are a renter in a condo and you are not tied, inherently financially to the asset, you've got a volunteer condo board, expert or not, who are going to really be driving your rental rates outside of even your landlord's control. And so that there's a lack of predictability right now. If you're renting right now in a condo, a 2-bedroom for $6,000 a month, it is totally conceivable the next year it could be $9,000 a month, depending on what's going on in the condo and their certifications, their reserves, the studies that they have pending for this year.
One of the things we've talked about how it affects older residents. What we haven't talked about is young residents. We haven't today, or at least today we haven't talked about. I've talked about it with my own children about what it costs.
The future of our region is the people who are probably feeling it proportionately the most.
Yeah, it's funny because people would come down here for the winter weather. You would get these young people from up north that would, finish school, come down here, want to go to the beach or go on a boat on the weekends and really enjoy the weather. And they came here, they were attracted, low tax rates and the like, and much lower expense for living than in New York or
Boston
Chicago.
Or San Francisco.
Right.
Now.
And now with the rates of rental rates going through the roof.
And the popularity of the region.
We are going to have a situation where young people are not going to be coming in droves. And that's our future workforce. That's the vibrancy of your community is based on people who are working, not retired people.
Or if they continue to come in droves, they're going to have to find viable alternatives. And again, tying it all the way back, that may be where the Aventors and the Durals become more viable in terms of living options if you're going to move to South Florida than the center of the city. Which is still dominated, at least in the development space right now, by full service luxury, both on the apartments and on the condos.
It's funny. New York City has little areas, if you will. You have the UN area, you have Soho, you have Greenwich Village, you have the Upper West Side, you have the Upper East Side, and it's funny how people stay within their little area. We're going to have the same thing in Miami and in Fort Lauderdale and in Palm Beach.
Sure. The old idea of neighborhoods. Boston, I grew up in the Boston area, and, Boston, city of Boston is 27 neighborhoods, and you basically stayed inside your neighborhood. Or if you needed to leave, you could just walk down the street and hop on a subway or a bus that could bring you to one of hundreds or thousands of places in the city, as opposed to Miami, where maybe it's dozens.
It's funny because we have the bus lanes on 836, but very few of our roads have the width to put bus lanes.
Right.
And, we haven't talked about buses, but buses are an alternative. But you got to have room to have a bus lane. If you don't have a bus lane, your bus is going to be stuck in traffic.
Right,
it's going to do
more vehicles
nothing
on the roads, right? Doesn't do anything. But I like the focus on young people, and it makes me think that we probably want to have some episodic focus just on what it means to be millennial or Gen Z in a place like South Florida. Which is to say,
it means you have more vacations and you work fewer hours.
Well, it's a rental economy to begin with.
I'm going to get in big trouble for that.
Look, it's a rental economy to begin with. And, you've got, more people using Uber, more people getting food delivered to their house, fewer people with any kind of savings or significant credit. You and I have talked about in the context of your children and their friends and their peers, how somebody at 30 years old right now would even begin to approach the idea of home ownership in Miami-Dade if you're not making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. And I don't mean $100,000 a year.
Yeah, and imagine if you have a child like my son just had a child. And by the way, we have a name, Ariel Benjamin, named after my father, Arnold. And all I can thank you, son and daughter-in-law Paloma, for naming my grandson, your child, after my father.
Paloma did the hard part.
Yes, she did the hard part. She did. But what I wanted to say is, how are those people going to afford to have a family and have a place to live? They can't barely survive now.
Well, let's use the basic math and say the average home in Miami-Dade is sitting in the neighborhood of $500,000. And so, even with rates beginning to come down, and they're not ever, we're not going to see the 2% anymore. But even if we start to see the 5% again, you still have to have $50,000 to $100,000 in cash on hand, and $3,000 or $4,000 a month for a mortgage. And
what about taxes?
And taxes.
You're going to have taxes of $10,000 a year. So if you add up your mortgage payment, your taxes, your water bill, your electric bill, which is going to be high because of air conditioning in the summer, you're talking about not spending 33.33% on your disposable income. You're talking about spending well over 50%, and you still have to eat. And these people Uber Eats constantly.
It's the avocado toast culture. I mean, they would rather spend $12 or $15 on a single dish and a single meal and have it be convenient. And look, maybe there's a comeuppance. I mean, maybe that generation also has to address some of their underlying issues in terms of their spend and save patterns, because it's changed very rapidly. I'm Gen XY. And
I don't even know what that means.
Well, so I'm late 70s, early 80s, right? That's the Gen X cusp. My wife and I, my wife born in 80, I'm born in 77. We're at the tail end of Gen X. But our generation was very entrepreneurial, a lot of saving. There was a very different orientation. Now, the economy grew more significantly during our growing up period than it did for millennials and Gen Zs.
Remember something else. Gen Z and millennials look at this world that we are leaving them, and they are angry. They're angry about what we've done to the environment. They're angry about what we've done in terms of, this totally polarized political situation. They're angry about wars and hatred all over the world. It's a much different community of children and young people than it was when you may have been growing up. I know.
For the sake of argument, let me disagree and say I feel like every generation faces some version of that. And you're a little older than I am, and you grew up in the sort of Vietnam, post-Vietnam era. The generation that immediately preceded you, who are a little older than you, were protesting and angry about a lot of the same things. That had a carryover effect into your generation. Listen, when you're growing up years, political assassinations were, I hate to say it, even at the national level, commonplace. I mean, by the time we reached the assassination of Martin Luther King, you had lost JFK, you had lost his brother RFK, you lost Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, prolific generational leaders on a national stage. So it's not like there has not been upheaval in this country before. It's not like you haven't had generations show up and be angry and upset. I personally hypothesize the idea that we hear about it more because we're living in a social media generation. We're hearing it. They're getting more information and regurgitating more information, but it's not necessarily because war has been a defining quality of our culture for millennia. So war is not new. Angst of young people is not new. Pushing back against the previous generation is not new. I think we hear about it more.
I agree, we hear about it more.
But it's not like protests and war and violence and feeling like you're being handed. I mean, for my generation, a lot of it was focused on the environment, right? When I was growing up, it was acid rain and recycling and Captain Planet,
nuclear, energy
and war
and nuclear spills,
famine in Africa. I mean, so that was right. I mean, that's, I grew up in that environment. So again, it wasn't like it was devoid of it. What I feel like, and I'm not trying to pat my generation on the back, but I feel like my generation did still look at things more opportunistically and say, we can still make what we want. And it was the tech culture, well, right? I was part of the .com generation.
Remember that in the 50s, there was tremendous optimism in this country.
Mm-hmm.
And in
post World War II, the boom.
Right.
Right.
There is such pessimism amongst young people today. And it is probably because they see everything on their little handheld computer.
It's constantly reinforced right here.
Right. So they see negativity everywhere. And negativity sells in the news way more than positivity.
Right.
You see negative stories everywhere. And so they absorb that information, and I think they tend to be more pessimistic. Many of them don't even want to have children because of that. But going back to the housing crisis that they have, I don't see how it's sustainable for them. And I don't see, forgetting people in Miami making $100,000, what about the median income?
The 60s or 70s.
Of the 60s with a family of 4? How do they live above the poverty line? I don't even know how they do it.
Right. Well, let's use that as a jumping off point in terms of talking about what we're going to have multiple episodes in this season on, which is living in South Florida. So we've talked about everything through this paradigm of real estate and finance and economy. And as an extension of it, a lot of the reason that we are here to begin with is exactly what you said earlier, David. South Florida is an amazing place to live. Putting all of these challenges aside, it's an amazing place to live. And it's being recreated in front of us. I mean, one of the things that, I benefit from living kind of right in the city here is every time I pull out into Biscayne Boulevard and I look at the skyline, or I look at what's come up along the corridor, it changes. It feels like it changes every month. I mean, it feels like every time I look, there's a new high rise, a new building, a new zone of some kind of development.
But it's a sexy city. You look up, you see the blue sky, you see the glass towers.
80 degrees and skyscrapers and beach and boats and all of that. So we're going to spend some of this season focused, speaking of positive, on all of that really good stuff. Food is a big one, right? I mean,
and the art scene is a big one now.
When I moved to Miami in 2003, I will tell you, I was coming out of the Northeast where food has always
Just
been.
Don't mention Boston one more time on this show.
Well, food has always been big in the Northeast cities. I mean, legacy restaurants and the mix of cultures, whether it's, because you grew up in a city where there was a real Chinatown or a real Italian neighborhood or really, gourmet restaurants. When I moved to Miami in 2003, I can tell you it was anything but. It was very pedestrian. It was mostly touristy, and the nicest restaurants, quote unquote, were mostly the ones who looked the nicest. They were not necessarily particularly good.
Remember that we have the Perez Art Museum now.
Mm-hmm.
We have the Arsh Center and the Opera House. We have a concert hall. You have real culture. You have Art Basel. You have food and wine festivals. You have restaurateurs, major food group that you deal with, and others. And some of them have come from up north and brought down legacy restaurants here, whether it's Carbone or some other restaurants. Right. So they come down here, but then you have great chefs come down here and say, this is a booming market with people with a lot of money. I want to open up a restaurant in Miami. And it has become a big thing from restaurateurs from other places coming down here, opening up Michelin star restaurants that attract people, whether it's tourists or locals. Now, that's only high end typically, but you even have food trucks now that are getting Michelin stars. You always tell me about food trucks that get Michelin stars.
Right. Well, you've got, I think, in what you're alluding to is there's also been a wave of homegrown talent here in Miami that have created a new ethos in the food world, which is quality, not necessarily gourmet and not necessarily what we would traditionally think of as high end. And some of them even fashion themselves like refined holes in the wall, but they have won huge accolade. And whether it's restaurants that, are in Mimo and Little Haiti that have
they're
boomed.
all over. They're in Kendall. They're all over the place.
And you see them, and a lot of it's homegrown talent. I mean, and I think we have to nod to some of the chefs in the past who I think weathered the blight of Miami food. And I think of people like Michelle Bernstein, who was a standout long before Miami was a real food scene, and who has stayed a standout, but have inspired others. I think of One of my friends, Anies Meinhold, who's here in Mimo, who does the Fuck Yeah restaurants.
Did you just say fuck yeah?
PHUC, I'm allowed to say that. And by the way, we're not on over the air, so the FCC doesn't have a lot to say about this. But and they have a Bib Gourmand from Michelin. They've got a fun, energetic location.
I always thought a Bib Gourmand was a bib, but apparently it's some fancy name for an accolade.
Yes, it's a nod. It's a respectful nod. It's not a Michelin star, but it is an acknowledgement that it is top par food and service. And this idea, and I worked with Anies and her partner, Cesar Zapata, who's the chef there, at the Four Seasons when we were relatively kids, when we were in our 20s.
You had to get the Four Seasons in there.
I had to stick the Four Seasons in there. But the exciting thing about it is more and more of that have happened. And a similar colleague of mine, who was one of the founders of the Pabelli Group. And you see these homegrown chefs and restaurateurs who have brought a different sensibility. It's not just importing Carbone. It's not just bringing Il Molino down.
They bring the
Nobu.
flavors.
It's investing in that culture.
They bring the flavors of Haiti. They bring the flavors of South America. They bring the flavors of the Caribbean,
Yep.
And of course we have such a great amount of fresh fish. Mostly caught by me, but we have fresh.
Which may or may not have been cooked by me last night.
Right. But yes, that's true. But it was flaky yellowtail,
It was
which
delicious.
was delicious.
It was delicious.
But the point is that you have both foods, you have farm to table now in South Florida, a lot of
Great agriculture here. I mean,
Yep.
we're how far are we from the Redlands? And I mean, we've got a real agricultural table here in South Florida too.
Yeah. All of it's true.
So we're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about some of the new entrants. We're going to be talking about some of the legacies. I mean, I think it's great to juxtapose the idea. I know you've been a Joe Stonecraft guy for eons. And to say,
since I'm a child,
how do those legacy institutions, how do the Michelle Bernsteins, continue to fit in this backdrop of newer talent, newer development, again, the millennial and Gen Zs, and even folks in my generation who have created a different kind of food scene here in South Florida. And to tie it all back to our friends here at Sun, Sand, and Sold, is the way real estate impacts that, because we know that restaurants more often fail than not. And we also know it's location for restaurants.
And they're paying big rents.
And they're paying through the roof. And when you think about places, think about Pabelli Sushi in, Brickell City Center, the Swire at Brickell, and to think about, who knows even, what that rent, even looks like.
But remember, they're also attracting people. They're attracting people to, whether it's strip centers, whether it's malls, they're attracting people to come there to eat, and then people walk around. So there is a benefit to the owner of the property, but they're getting Lincoln Road. Think about the rents on Lincoln Road.
Sure. And really, I mean, Lincoln Road's been hit hard, for locals because it's unaffordable for a standalone local. I mean, you've got the Apple store and the Nike store. And from what I know of that ilk of real estate, particularly on Lincoln Road, is as big as those companies are, those stores lose money on rent a little the way, the Apple store on Fifth Avenue in New York might, because you have to have it there because
the amount of exposure that they get, the amount of tourists that come through. Every time I go in the Apple store, there's hundreds of people there.
Right. It's an attraction unto itself. So we're going to be talking about food, not only in light of the talent and the taste, and hopefully get a couple of fun restaurant tours on, but we're also going to be talking about it through the vision of real estate, and to say how, and tying it all the way back to our first conversation today, how do restaurateurs afford labor, reliable labor who rely on transportation?
Where are they coming from?
For my friend who owns a restaurant, 20 blocks up the street, how does she pay people who have to live an hour and a half away and deal with rent and deal with her own traffic insurance and all the issues that we've also been talking about? So there's a holistic view that you have to take of the South Florida lifestyle and economy, so much of which functions through the paradigm of real estate. So as much as we may be real estate focused by background, the reality is it touches almost everything we do. And one of the last areas we're going to be touching on a sort of an asset level, is fitness, is lifestyle. When we look at the number of gyms, health clubs, spas, specialty sports. So, whether it's, UFC or kickboxing or Pilates, yoga, all you got to do, and let's think about your neighborhood.
All you got to
over
do
Miami
is
Beach.
walk out into Sunset Harbor and you see people with the yoga mat every
Right. I mean,
single
you've got
day.
green frog yoga, anatomy, right? I mean, there's so many different versions of fitness and lifestyle. And
That's because people are outside in South Florida. They're not covered by a winter coat. They don't gain 20 pounds in the winter because of, sitting inside all day and it getting dark at 4 o'clock. So the reality is South Florida is a place for healthy people who want to eat healthy, exercise, whether it's walking, bicycling, or going to Pilates or yoga.
Yeah, and so I think one of the things that we're going to tap on is who's leading that charge and where does it go from here, particularly in light of the increasing costs? Because one of the things that I've heard a lot from people, whether it's in a development that I may be working on or in the fitness community that I'm a part of, is how to continue to create viability and affordability around that. Because again, the reality is it's getting more expensive for everybody to staff the front desk at the gym, to hold the real estate, to find parking.
And pay rent.
And pay rent.
So I think what you're also going to see, and we have seen this over the last decade, is people working with trainers in their home where they come to you and you do this.
Online or otherwise, yeah.
Right. And I've seen you use the bands, so you don't need a big gym. People are getting out of the gym now. They're starting to do more cardio. They're starting to use bands. They're starting to use weight resistance from their own bodies. I know we're getting hyper technical here, but the reality is gyms are expensive. Well, for the rent.
They are expensive. And I think what's even more interesting from a real estate perspective, particularly a commercial real estate perspective, is they also occupy a huge amount of space. Gyms are not small. And so you also have this issue of saying, but if gyms go away, and I'd be really curious to take a dive, and maybe I will with my friends at CoStar, especially if wink, wink, they want to reduce my monthly license fee on that, is to look at the amount of fitness or lifestyle occupied space in a place like South Florida, because even though it doesn't compare by the numbers to restaurants, when you look at the amount of space required for a gym, thousands of square feet, it's probably a big chunk of our market. When I think about what is anchoring some of these buildings, when I think about what's anchoring some of the hotels that we live and work around, Anatomy at the One Hotel in Miami Beach, Equinox at the Four Seasons in Brickell. These are flagged fitness institutions operating within flagged hotel properties, but they operate independently but support one another.
Well, remember something. When you're dealing with commercial properties, you're trying to drive traffic. How much traffic are you driving for a person who just was sweating for an hour and a half? Other than if it's a juice bar, they're not spending any more time. They're going and leaving.
Right. And is that some of the live work? Is that, again, where you're going to be saying is the best place for that type of fitness to be more in proximity to a place where my office is here, my home is here, my gym is here. Why fitness amenities, David, in developments have become so prolific. So now when I'm assisting in the development of a condominium or a multifamily, there is no question about the size and depth of fitness anymore. Before, a really big gym was just a waste of space and money.
Yeah, but now they all want to have a view of the water.
Then they demand that space, because it also becomes a question of economics to them.
But remember, back in the day when I lived in a condo when I was a kid, the big thing was to have a card room. Remember those card rooms?
Sure.
And the old people would sit around and play gin rummy, and the
they
ladies would play
mahjong. Ballrooms, restaurants in condos.
Right.
Right. Very different lifestyle. That was more of that resort lifestyle.
And now it's all about gym and amenities like
a yoga studio. A multifamily I just helped open has a podcast studio in the multifamily.
What about an office? Where you can rent an office for the day, or there are pods available where you can
conference rooms. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It's all part of that. And so I think some of this dive into, some of these asset types and classes on a rental basis or a buy basis is also about what the residents are demanding. And when you're in a place like Miami, different than a place like New York, different than a place like Chicago, you're not in proximity to everything walkably or through public transportation. So the demand to have it right there is much higher.
Well, you also remember something. One of the greatest expenses of multifamily and condo is parking.
Yep.
And underground parking used to be the big thing, right? But now that we have floods and king tides and rising water, a lot of the parking is above ground. And it's expensive to put 8 floors of parking. And one of the things people always talked about is how many parking spaces do I get?
Right.
It used to be you get one or two, and
one
then
and plus a valet spot,
right,
or one and a guest spot.
And now people are like, but I want to buy extra. And the rich people, they want to buy extra spots for their Ferrari or their Maserati or their Lamborghini or their Bentley, and I could keep going in Miami because it's a car town as well.
Sure.
And so is Palm Beach. These are big car cities. LA used to be the big car city, and Miami is a big car city. So what's going to happen if we don't have mass transit? How are we going to fit all these people in the cars, and how expensive is that for developers in multifamily or condo? And if we had more of the mass transit, would it reduce the cost of building?
Well, because the demand would be lower.
Because in New York, they have very few parking spaces.
A lot of buildings with no parking.
That's correct.
Basically say go find a Kinney garage nearby.
That's right.
So in summary here, season 2 on Sun, Sand, and Sold, we're really going to run the gamut. I mean, we're going to have a lot of fun looking at everything from public transportation and the fight between the county and the municipalities. We're going to be talking about the arts. We're going to be talking about food. We're going to be talking about fitness. We're going to be talking about the boating community. We're going to be talking with engineers. The last thing we're going to be talking about, which I know is David's absolute favorite, and I'm going to have to tape his mouth closed on this episode, is we're going to be doing a pretty deep dive into prop tech. We're going to be talking about property technology, the way that technology is now facilitating so much of this and how it's tied together. In fact, that's going to be our first panel show. We're going to have a full panel of tech experts, including the founders and leaders of some of the biggest tech companies actually in the nation, who are going to join us and talk about where technology is taking all of this. Because what's really interesting is technology is a reflection of the industry, and it's aggregating it. When I'm doing development work now, we're not only talking about property technology that helps facilitate residents on site, but what they do on site, including ordering room service and booking amenities like office space on site.
Well, also, what's interesting is if it's a second, third, or fourth home, everything's on their phone, from their air conditioning to their lights to
smart home technology.
Who's going into their unit and the like. I thought, though, that when you were going to say the final thing we want to talk about was my shirt. Well, because I have to tell you,
even in a preview show, your shirt is
pretty impressive.
It is. Now, is it, the buttons look very new and shiny, kind of mother of pearlish, but almost has a throwback quality. Your shirt almost looks vintage.
Well, it does almost look vintage, but I bought it in North Carolina. Shout out to Blowing Rock, beautiful little shop where bought these shirts that I will be wearing. But I do want to say that season 2 will continue to have very, very loud, colorful shirts that I will wear in order to stand out.
And you always stand out. You could have nothing on you, you'd stand out, but not in the way that any of us would appreciate.